The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will now come to order. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first hearing of the WOW Subcommittee in the 117th Congress. I'm excited about that. We have a new ranking member, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Benz. Had a great meeting with Mr. Benz recently, and he just brings a very unique and exceptional background on water law and policy. So I think he's going to be an excellent ranking member, and I look forward to working with you, Mr. Benz, and everyone else on this subcommittee. We are meeting today to hear testimony on Building Back Better, building resilience for the economy, climate, and ecosystems under Committee Rule 4F. Any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designee. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep their schedule. However, I will, as a courtesy, allow an additional opening statement from the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Westerman, who I believe is going to be joining us as well. I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. And hearing no objection, that is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository for the subcommittee. And that is at this email address, hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. So as with in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff, but only to avoid inadvertent background noise. And finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should reach out and inform committee staff right away, and we will get that taken care of. I will begin this hearing by recognizing myself for my opening remarks. We have a lot of work ahead of us in this Congress. We need to think about how we help the people in our districts also get back to work, help them provide for their families and stay safe and healthy. Because on top of the pandemic, this is on top of the pandemic, Americans face 22 separate billion-dollar-plus weather and climate disasters in 2020. Americans have dealt with record-breaking wildfires, with the highest ever number of named hurricanes and tropical storms, the recent deadly freeze that caused millions to lose power. We've had challenging drought conditions, and it's looking like a severe drought in many parts of the West this year. And other climate-related events are just becoming more frequent and severe. But despite these challenges, I see reason for hope. President Biden's administration is distributing vaccines much faster than predicted even a few months ago. Executive actions are reversing much of the damage to our environment and beginning to repair our international standing. And we now have an opportunity to build our economy back better. And we can do that by rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure so that it's sustainable and resilient to those impacts of climate change. So let's get started. Today, our subcommittee meets to discuss how policies and programs within our jurisdiction will help our nation build back better. For Western water management, a Building Back Better plan must include preparing our communities for climate change-induced drought. And the most recent U.S. Drought Monitor report shows almost 80% of the Western United States is currently in drought. Scientists also say we may be heading into a mega drought in the Southwest after nearly 2 decades of dry conditions. Managing our increasingly strained water resources will require significant infrastructure upgrades. And unfortunately, our federal investment in aging water infrastructure has not even come close to keeping pace with the need. We're not talking about just new stuff. We've got thousands of existing dams and canals and pipelines and other things that need to be updated, need to be maintained. Just last week, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave our nation's dams a D grade in their recent report card. According to the Congressional Research Service, in the past 30 years, the federal contribution to water infrastructure spending has fallen from 63% of total capital spending to a mere 9% in recent years. So the need is great, but so is the opportunity. And part of that opportunity is the fact that interest rates are effectively at zero right now. So we can borrow our own money free of charge to do some of this important work. Now is the time to invest in modern water infrastructure that helps stretch our water supplies for the future. And that includes investment in virtually drought-proof supply projects like water reuse and desalination. We also should invest in water conservation and efficiency projects and innovative modern water storage. Preparing for dry climate conditions will require investments in healthy freshwater ecosystems to preserve fish and wildlife during future droughts and challenging climate conditions. Building a more resilient water future must also address historic inequities. We need to include solutions to close the tribal water access gap. Native households are 19 times more likely to lack complete plumbing than white households. And that's made especially challenging for many tribal communities. It's made it more challenging to establish viable homelands, to sustain viable economies, or even stop the spread of diseases through times like these, through the COVID pandemic. In the last Congress, this subcommittee advanced many forward-thinking collaborative policy solutions to tackle all of these water supply challenges. And many of those were enacted into law, but there's still a lot of work to do. And I look forward to continuing that work in this new Congress. Turning to our coasts, the seafood industry faces unique challenges in the pandemic. Our state coastal programs are severely underfunded as state budgets have been slashed. And the ocean is still warming and acidifying and rising. The good news is there are many nature-based solutions that can help us solve and confront the climate crisis and get people back to work as we do it. For example, we can provide grant money to put people to work on shovel-ready coastal restoration projects like we did after the 2009 crash and that recovery. We can promote similar grants for blue carbon ecosystem restoration projects that sequester carbon and protect our coasts from storms. We can build up working waterfronts, wetlands, oyster beds, living shorelines, and restorative aquaculture. And the federal government can commit to only purchasing American seafood and supporting our fishing industry and reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. So last thing, we've got a lot of work to do for wildlife. We talked in the last Congress about our biodiversity crisis. Species are facing an extinction crisis from human impacts like habitat destruction and climate change, and we can put a lot of people back to work by restoring habitat. A lot of possibilities, a lot of opportunities. I look forward to working on all of that with the new members of the committee and the returning members of the committee as we undertake this effort to build back better. And with that, I recognize Ranking Member Benz for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I represent Oregon's 2nd District, which is 69,000 square miles in size and which includes all or part of 20 counties, about 2/3 of the state. Many of the natural resource issues facing my constituents are those that fall squarely within the jurisdiction of this committee and, of course, this subcommittee. So I'm pleased to be the ranking member, and I want to thank Ranking Member Westerman for giving me this opportunity. I also look forward to a productive working relationship with Subcommittee Chair Huffman and, of course, his staff. Mr. Chair, it's my hope that the witnesses today and after today will share in their view of the problems we face as they relate to the economy, climate, ecosystems, exactly what they think the problem is that we're trying to solve. We need to learn from our witnesses what they think we should address first. As we look to a future of hotter days, longer summers, and less water. And in what order should we prioritize our response? Our pocketbook is not unlimited, and we need to define first the problems we face, and then we can better proceed by tackling those problems in order of importance. So I'm looking forward to the witnesses prioritize what they have to say today and how best we can approach the problems as they define them. For a long time, members of both sides of the aisle have championed projects that address pieces of the puzzle, but these problems, most obviously out here in the West, the out-of-control wildfires that need solutions without talking about how we're going to scale up to address them. We need to be able to talk critically about the costs and benefits and be willing to reject plans that are not effective. So today's hearing marks the first step towards what this subcommittee might suggest be included in an infrastructure bill, and that will include investments in helping us adapt to hotter, drier years. And of course, we support protecting and promoting investments in infrastructure, regardless of what the cause might be. Major dams, reservoirs, and delivery systems in the Western United States are essential components of our everyday lives, and they are many old and out of condition. We can do lots when it comes to lining canals and other things to result in water savings. We have massive swaths of federal forests that are on the verge of becoming massive infernos because they've been neglected for decades. Everyone agrees that the emissions from these wildfires harm economies, fish, wildfire watersheds. So we look forward to hearing what our witnesses have to say when it comes to addressing that incredible challenge. So we agree that improvements can and in fact must be made, but there are larger questions about how we define infrastructure and of course, who's going to pay for it. And top-down federal administrative legislative mandates that limit access to our federal lands and waters, making projects cost prohibitive, will not help and in fact will only stifle innovation. Instead, we should promote regulatory streamlining that facilitates green energy, results in jobs in our rural communities, and let's harness the free market forces so that costs of such necessary investment can be shared. These are just some of the questions and issues we'll hopefully deliberate upon today, and I hope we will do so in a bipartisan manner. I also hope that future infrastructure legislation that is under this committee's jurisdiction, subcommittee's jurisdiction, goes through regular order so we can have meaningful dialogue and debate on the merits of proposals. As we begin today's proceedings, I'd like to welcome our witnesses. In particular, we're fortunate to have Mr. Dan Keppen, a constituent from Klamath Falls, Oregon, who happens also to be the executive director of the Family Farm Alliance. His organization not only has been a voice for agriculture, it also has been at the forefront of working with stakeholders across the spectrum in finding solutions from a West-wide perspective. I also want to welcome Dr. Cassandra Mosley from the University of Oregon for her participation in this hearing. Dan and Cassandra, it's great to see you again, and I welcome you to this subcommittee. With that, I yield back my time.
Well, I thank the ranking member, and I understand the full committee's ranking member, Mr. Westerman, is here and would like to give opening remarks. So, Mr. Westerman, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman. It's good to be here today, and I would like to welcome our subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Benz. If you look at his resume, it would be hard to find someone that's more qualified to serve as a member or ranking member on the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee with his background in water law and his service in the Oregon legislature. I really look forward to his leadership and his work with you, Chairman Huffman, on the committee. I also want to welcome all the subcommittee members and witnesses to today's hearing. It's my hope that we can resume in-person hearings soon, especially given the recent CDC guidelines on those who have been vaccinated. I especially want to thank the witnesses for their written testimony. I spent a lot of time reading that last night, and if you can give that testimony in 5 minutes, I might give you a gold star because I think you've got more material there than you could get out in 5 minutes. But I was very excited to see some of the ideas that I think are bipartisan as far as the importance of forestry and forest management on water quality. And today's hearing is about facilitating infrastructure and promoting clean watersheds in a changing climate. These are bipartisan ideas, or at least they should be. We all want a clean environment, but we must achieve it in ways that enhance our competitiveness and security while not giving a free pass to China and Russia. As we've seen from the shale gas boom, America can reduce global emissions more effectively through innovation and the free market than over-regulating of our domestic resources. We should be building off these successes, not trying to shut down more and more of our domestic suppliers. We should also be incentivizing natural climate solutions, such as those outlined in my Trillion Trees Act. Some of our witnesses today rightly believe that forest management on our federal lands is necessary to avoid catastrophic forest fires and to protect our water supplies from debris and contamination. Given the depth of the forest health problem, we also need to think about how we streamline the work that is done. While local collaboratives and the Shared Stewardship Initiative created by the previous administration have helped identify key projects and gotten some work done, the pace and scale of these efforts needs to increase dramatically. That is, if we're going to make a difference. Projects identified through those collaborative processes should not take years before physical work on the ground begins. I look forward to working to solving this problem to ensure these critical watersheds are protected. It's a simple scientific fact that if we have fewer catastrophic fires, we will have lower emissions. Even less emissions will result if we harness the power of moving water. Hydropower is the original green energy and is still our biggest renewable energy source. It also acts as a backup for other renewable energies like wind and solar. Yet, despite the long-standing success of hydropower, this country still has not tapped into 12,000 megawatts of capacity that could be added to existing dams, and that's according to a report from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. There are significant barriers to this development, to be sure, but one of the biggest is the regulatory environment. As one witness who oversaw projects at FERC said before this committee in 2006, hydropower, quote, is stagnant, end quote, because of the regulatory decision-making authority that allows agencies under this committee's jurisdiction to impose mandatory conditions on non-federal hydropower projects. Sometimes these conditions are legitimate. Other times they're costly, unrelated to the project, and conflict with the other agency conditions. If our end goal is reduced emissions, we ought to unleash hydropower's true potential instead of crushing it with red tape. Lastly, I would add that a focus for today is more federal spending. Before we start pouring more money into the agencies under the subcommittee's jurisdiction, we should hear from these agencies on exactly how they plan to spend the massive amount of American taxpayer dollars and implement the new programs from the last omnibus appropriations bill. That's just good governance. Although it's unclear from some of the testimonies here today whether any new programs will result from this hearing, this authorizing committee should follow regular order when it comes to adding new programs to an infrastructure bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. We are now going to turn to our terrific panel to guide this discussion. And here's the batting order that we're going to have. We're going to start with Ms. Laura Ziemer, who is Senior Counsel and Water Policy Advisor at Trout Unlimited. Then we will hear from Captain Alexander Modjeski, the Habitat Restoration Program Director at the American Littoral Society. Following that, we will hear from Dr. Cassandra Mosley, a research professor and senior policy advisor at the Ecosystem Workforce Program at the University of Oregon. And then batting cleanup will be Mr. Dan Keppen, executive director of the Family Farm Alliance. Let me remind all of our witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but the entire statement, including some of the lengthier ones that you have already submitted to us in writing, that's going to be part of the hearing record. And when you begin, the timer will appear on your Zoom screen in one of the boxes. It will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. And I recommend that members and witnesses who are joining us today remotely lock that timer on their screen so they can keep track of it as we go. After your testimony is complete, please do remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. And I'll also allow the entire panel to testify before we bring it back to the members for questions. So with all of that, the chair now recognizes Ms. Ziemer for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and subcommittee members. I'd first like to thank you all for your work on the recent omnibus bill. The new laws advance tribal water settlements and promote smart water investments. And the committee's work recognizes that drought is one of the West's greatest expressions of climate change. This makes water investments a top priority for building climate resilience. The Colorado River Basin demonstrates the need. More than 40 million people rely on the basin for their water. The economic importance of the Colorado River is over $1.4 trillion annually. But by 2060, demand for water from the river may exceed supply by more than 1 million acre feet. Federal investments to address the challenges facing watersheds across the West will help the United States build back better for economic recovery, climate resilience, and tribal sovereignty. We need increased funding for irrigation infrastructure projects through such programs as Reclamation's Water Smart program. We need increased funding for municipal water conservation and for construction of the Title 16 authorized projects for water recycling and reuse. The Congressional Research Service estimates that the federal share for the construction of these 107 authorized projects would be just about $1 billion. We need to extend deposit into Reclamation's Tribal Water Settlement Fund for another 10 years and to make the fund permanent through passage of HR 1904. And we need to make our natural infrastructure more drought resilient by investing in watershed restoration. Reclamation's Cooperative Watershed Management Program and newly authorized Aquatic Ecosystem Restoration Program are two good examples. In addition, the popular Partners for Fish and Wildlife program of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service provides important habitat restoration opportunities on working lands. To build coastal climate resilience, as described by Chairman Huffman, NOAA's Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund and its community-based restoration program are cost-effective programs. In California, Trout Unlimited's North Coast Coho project has put over 100 projects to the ground with support from NOAA's programs. We do this in partnership with timber companies, other landowners, federal, state, local agencies, and conservation districts. And these partnership-driven projects make the coastal watersheds of Northern California more climate resilient for its communities and imperiled salmon. These projects create resilience by removing barriers to fish passage, connecting aquatic habitats, and restoring river function. These investments are job creators. They keep money in rural counties with good-paying jobs. My written testimony cites academic research documenting that the return on investment for watershed restoration matches, and in some cases exceeds, the job creation and economic growth from traditional infrastructure projects. From a climate resilience standpoint, we can't afford not to fund watershed restoration. These investments restore hydrologic processes to retain the water from a shrinking snowpack in soil and in floodplains. This restoration of a landscape scale sponge, as it were, makes water supplies more resilient to climate change. It makes working lands more resilient to drought, and it improves fish and wildlife habitat. I'd like to close with a story about those best-in-class projects that Representative Bentz mentioned that solve multiple problems at once, the kind that should be prioritized. My longtime friend and colleague, Dan Keppen of the Family Farm Alliance, is an avid booster of irrigation upgrades that also provide benefits to rivers and fish. And it was around this shared interest that Dan and I helped create the Western Agricultural and Conservation Coalition over a decade ago to do just that, to support and encourage the common ground of sustaining working lands and the fish and wildlife those lands support. WAC member Mark Thalacker is the manager of the Three Sisters Irrigation District in Eastern Oregon. Mark has led by example in piping 55 of 64 miles of canal, installing a fish screen, building fish-friendly in-canal hydropower, and permanently returning water to Wychus Creek so that salmon can swim through Sisters, Oregon for the first time since 1884. The agricultural benefits from Mark's persistence: drastically lower pumping costs, high efficiency sprinklers, reliable water delivery, and higher crop yields. We need more irrigation infrastructure investment to produce more projects like Mark Thalacker's. I really appreciate the committee's attention to Western water issues, and thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Zemer. The chair now recognizes Captain Majeski for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Good afternoon, and hello from New Jersey. My name is Captain Alec Majeski, and I am the Habitat Restoration Program Director at the American Lip Society with over 26 years of experience in science-based ecological restoration. I am also a United States Air Force Desert Storm veteran and a licensed captain through the Merchant Marines. Thank you for the opportunity to present on the need and importance of a dedicated, long-term national investment in the conservation and restoration of natural habitats as part of our country's efforts to rebuild our communities, our environment, and our economy. This commitment is necessary not only to conserve and restore vital elements of our environment, but also provide the goods and services necessary to improve community resiliency and create jobs in the face of a changing climate. Simply, habitat restoration creates jobs. It provides community resiliency, it stimulates local economies, better allows us to prepare for disasters, and connects communities to nature. The benefits to coastal resiliency, the ecology, and the economy resulting from habitat restoration are essential in the nation's efforts to build back better. The American Little Society is a member-based coastal conservation organization. Since the late 1990s, we have completed more than 50 restoration projects and restored or enhanced over 300 acres of important coastal and shoreline habitat, including oyster reefs, clam beds, dunes, wetland and pond habitats, and intertidal habitats like flats, salt marshes, and mangroves. Habitat restoration is crucial on so many levels. Through our work, we have quickly restored beach habitat post-Hurricane Sandy to help save the federally listed red knot and build resiliency for small rural communities located in southern New Jersey. We have provided millions of dollars to local businesses, either directly through implementation of the restoration work or indirectly through increased ecotourism, and we created 40 jobs. We created a paid U.S. military veterans program. This program is veterans serving from the Korean War to Afghanistan, exposure to a new career field, and money to help themselves and their families during their transition to civilian life. And we have set the foundation for long-term Delaware Bay restoration by working with federal partners to develop an efficient, comprehensive vision of conservation through a multi-year federal regional permit that allows us to be shovel-ready when funding becomes available. By restoring salt marsh, creating oyster reefs, opening streams and rivers for fish passage, restoration provides a myriad benefits that support several congressional interests relating to carbon sequestration, biodiversity, economic growth and sustainability, water quality, and sea level rise from climate change. The strategies implemented in New Jersey can provide lessons and have positive solutions for states across the nation struggling with similar issues related to climate change and economic downturn, loss of habitat, and loss of resources. Habitat restoration is also financially sound. A healthy economy depends on a healthy environment. Restoring habitat supports local economies by providing jobs, patrons to local businesses, and places where visitors can go to connect with nature and open spaces. An estimated 30 jobs are generated for every $1 million invested in coastal restoration, which equates to more than twice as many jobs as the oil and gas and road construction industries combined. It is estimated that the U.S. restoration economy generated approximately 221,000 jobs and $24.86 billion in economic output in 2014. Habitat restoration and nature-based strategies or solutions also promote and improve community resiliency. In southern New Jersey, average flood damage from storms before habitat restoration was estimated to be over $140,000, which dropped drastically post-restoration to $3,700 per storm for the same level of storm surge. During Hurricane Sandy, the majority of New Jersey coastline was decimated. Coastal communities with dunes fared better than those that did not, and wetlands provided storm protection and avoided $625 million in direct flood damages. The flood protection benefits associated with these habitats further warrants the long-term investment in restoring natural elements to promote resiliency. We don't just restore habitat, we restore the community connectivity to that habitat and to the ecology and services it provides. Our habitat restoration model embraces community connectivity, advisory committees, volunteers, military veterans, community scientists, paid restoration corps, interns, and in-kind services. In closing, habitat restoration can provide natural solutions that sustain or improve community resiliency and engagement, improve ecological uplift, foster public and private partnerships, create jobs, and generate a solid return in investment. For all these reasons and more, I can't list in 5 minutes, we need a long-term investment and a more programmatic approach to habitat restoration. We have an opportunity for habitat restoration to improve disaster preparedness, stimulate our local economies, and protect the natural resources we depend upon. We have an opportunity and an obligation to build our country back better and support long-term initiatives like habitat restoration that will benefit all Americans for generations to come. Thank you, and I'm happy to respond to any questions the committee might have.
Thank you very much, Captain. The chair now recognizes Dr. Mosley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Huffman, Ranking Member Benz, and members of the committee. I really want to thank you all for the opportunity to speak before you today about how we can increase climate resilience of our rural communities and our watersheds and how to foster economic recovery at the same time. I'm a research professor and the senior policy advisor at the Ecosystem Workforce Program at the University of Oregon. I'm also the interim vice president for research and innovation here at UO, although today I'm speaking as a faculty member. As we heard in the opening statements, increasing drought, declining snowpack, increasing stream temperatures, and storms are all putting our communities and the ecosystems upon which they depend in increasing risk. In the American West, some of the most urgent watershed issues are related to drought and the growing amount of uncharacteristic wildfire, which is increasingly threatening our drinking water, homes, businesses, and waterways. Watershed restoration is really a broad set of activities that we can think of as sort of a green infrastructure that improves the functioning of our forests, rangeland, and rivers. And these restoration projects can, in turn, really reduce the threats of wildfire, flooding, and other natural hazards to our communities. Projects in this space are incredibly ranging and can include wildfire risk reduction, salmon habitat improvements, and retrofitting of dams to improve irrigation and provide fish-friendly hydropower. Not only do these projects have ecological and community benefits, they create jobs. As you've already heard, there's a lot of job numbers to throw around here. But our research here at the University of Oregon suggests that in Oregon, when you invest $1 million in forest and watershed restoration, you create between 15 and 24 jobs. Most of these jobs, our studies show, are created in small businesses located in rural areas and small towns. And today I want to suggest 4 key ingredients to success in this space of integrating restoration and rural community well-being and economic recovery. First, we need more investments on the ground. While it's difficult to tally up the total investments needed across a broad set of watershed restoration activities, it certainly runs into the trillions of dollars. Take just one small example. On the National Forest System in Oregon, there is something like $390 million worth of NEPA-ready thinning and prescribed fire projects in need of funding right now. In addition to the urgent and sustained need for more fuels treatment dollars, there are many other programs at USDA that can help private landowners, Interior, Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, that can productively increase support for priority restoration efforts across multiple landowners. And as a matter of social equity, when we execute grant programs, we really need to pay close attention to how we structure the matching requirements so that lower resource communities can access these funds. Second, we need to double down on collaboration and partnerships as we seek to expand work on the ground. Over the past 30 years, it's become abundantly clear that collaboration is the central way that we build the necessary social agreement and organize the capacity and the funding to get projects done. This is most starkly true in river restoration projects that typically include multiple landowners and many regulatory agencies, but it's also true in public forest restoration across the West, where collaborative processes build social agreement and the necessary focus to get projects done. And as importantly, it's becoming increasingly clear that in some rural communities, the collaborative capacity we build around watershed restoration is the same capacity that gets adapted when communities need to prepare for, respond to, and recover from natural hazard. This kind of capacity is a key ingredient that helps both lower the social vulnerability, the physical vulnerability, but also the social vulnerability. Third, we need to focus on training and job quality. Because of the seasonal nature of restoration, it's critical that workers develop a diverse set of skills that enable them to have sustainable employment across multiple seasons and work in emergency response. There are a number of community-based organizations and tribes that have developed strong on-the-ground training programs, and these kinds of organizations can really help with this job training as we continue to expand it. Fourth, and finally, we need new investments in interdisciplinary research. Over the past several decades, many of the agencies under this committee's jurisdiction have really made vital investments in climate change research and that have in the understanding of climate change on our waterways, fisheries, and landscapes. As we grapple with these new realities, we now need more additional research that is interdisciplinary in nature and focused on applied biophysical science, as well as increased investigations in social science. We need more information and knowledge about both how to create climate-ready restoration projects and enhance the adaptive capacity of our communities. Let me conclude again by thanking the committee for holding this a very important hearing, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mosley. The chair now welcomes Dan Keppen to testify. Dan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and the members of the subcommittee. Thanks for inviting me to testify before you today. The Family Farm Alliance is a grassroots organization of family farmers, ranchers, irrigation districts, and allied industries in 16 Western states. We're driven by our belief that Western irrigated agriculture must be preserved and protected for a host of reasons. The American food consumer nationwide has access to fruits, vegetables, nuts, grains, and beef throughout the year. That's largely because of Western producers and the projects that provide water to these farmers and ranchers. Western irrigators have been dealing with changes in climate and hydrology for over a century, but the outlook for water supplies in the future is not positive. There's also growing demand for existing water supplies from growing cities and the environment. Unfortunately, there are some interests who simply view irrigated agriculture as a target for one thing, their water. We must look to several solutions in order to maintain food security for the nation and economic well-being of the Western landscape. First, we must invest in Western water infrastructure. A suite of new water supply enhancement projects and demand management programs can help alleviate the stress on our existing Western water supplies. We must also invest in technology. We must manage our water supplies better, more efficiently, and effectively. We can use technology to improve modeling and better predict weather patterns, snowpack, and runoff forecasting. New technology can also help us better manage water to improve efficiencies. We need to improve regulatory processes at the federal level to expedite permitting and get these projects to construction within a reasonable period of time at a reasonable cost. And finally, there are opportunities to create collaborative partnerships, as others have said today, between federal, state, and local entities who are also interested in finding solutions to our water climate problems. These solutions can be reached using adaptive strategies that can work on the ground. New water infrastructure projects can help mitigate the impacts of climate-driven hydrologic changes on the environment. At the same time, they support Western farms, ranches, and rural communities. For example, as outlined in my testimony, multi-benefit fish and wildlife habitat restoration projects in California's Sacramento River Valley and in Washington's Yakima River Basin have been led by local irrigators. They want to improve fisheries for the long term in order to protect irrigation water supplies. Congress has helped this past year by including the Bureau of Reclamation's provisions in the massive appropriations package that was passed last December. The creation of an aging infrastructure account in Treasury for loans to local water users will help fund and affordably finance improvements and rehab of our aging facilities, some of which are over a century old. Other new authorities in that bill will broaden water smart grants, create a new collaborative program for snowpack monitoring and runoff forecasting, and improve the use of federal facilities for aquifer recharge. All of these new programs will be very helpful in managing impacts to water resources from climate change in the West. But we have more to accomplish in this Congress. We need to reauthorize and fund federal programs to partner on new federal and non-federal water storage and groundwater recharge projects. This includes extending provisions in the WIN Act of 2016. Funding must be provided to the aging federal infrastructure account that I just mentioned that was created last year. And Congress must support new technology to improve the management of water supplies for agriculture, cities, and the environment. What we do not need is more federal regulatory red tape and added environmental requirements for new federal programs. We fear that new mandatory environmental strengths could further increase costs, disincentivize voluntary approaches, and quickly render otherwise viable water projects as infeasible. We believe that investments in improving water conservation, water recycling, watershed management, conveyance, desalination, water transfers, groundwater storage, and surface water storage are all needed for a diversified, resilient, and successful water management portfolio. And we're not alone at Family Farm Alliance on this platform. A national coalition of over 200 ag, urban, and water organizations sent letters to the White House and congressional leaders in early January. They too want Congress to address Western water infrastructure now. The coalition includes organizations from 15 states. The groups represent nearly 1/3 of all ag production in the country and tens of millions of urban and rural water users. A copy of that letter is attached to my admittedly long written testimony. We look forward to working with your subcommittee to address the issues we have identified in this testimony and those that we have not. We'll continue our efforts to ensure irrigated ag is able to successfully continue to play a vital role in feeding our nation while keeping our rural communities and our environment healthy. Thanks again for this opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Keppen, and there's no penalty for a very long written testimony. So you took appropriate advantage of that opportunity, and that'll be part of the record. I definitely want to come back to you and Ms. Ziemer, who you've worked together on collaborative things, and I want to spend a little more time discussing the secret sauce to how you found those win-win solutions. But I have a couple of members of the subcommittee who are going to need to leave early, so I'm going to defer my questions for now. And we will start with Mr. Costa. I'm told that on the Republican side, Mr. Fulcher is going to go first, so he'll be on deck. Mr. Costa, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, you cut out.
Oh, there we go. We can hear you, Jim. Go right ahead.
Okay, very. I want to thank the subcommittee for your courtesy first, and the ranking member and all the members of the committee. 17 years that I've been in Congress, this is truly one of my favorite subcommittees, and we have a lot of good work to do. And I think building back better, Mr. Chairman, is a good way to start this effort off in the new Congress. Your comments in light of the difficulty of climate change that we're all dealing with in terms of resilience and focus on sustainability, given the changes in what Mother Nature is providing our resources, I think is a key. So therefore, we've got work cut out for us. This subcommittee has a tremendous opportunity to make the necessary investments in our water infrastructure, as you noted in your comments. We are facing extreme drought conditions in the West. Sadly, once again, we've been through these droughts, and I think we have to reassess in 10-year averages truly what our rainfall gives us and the snowpack. And doing so, mindful of the investments in terms of our aging water infrastructure, as you noted. I would also include habitat restoration, which has been spoken of. There are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of backlog projects on habitat restoration, as well as investing, as you noted, in our dams and in our conveyance facilities. In California, we're very aware of the Frank Kern Canal, the Delta Mendota Canal, California Aqueduct, all of which I have in legislation to make some of these reinvestments. Within this process, I think it's critical to bring everyone to the table. As you noted, the secret sauce that has worked in other projects before is what we ought to look to attain. Groundwater sustainability is one of the efforts I'm working on with Californians on our voluntary agreement to we must have flexibility in our water storage and conveyance. For indicated in your testimony has to be a part of it. Frankly, I think really matters. I'm not pointing fingers or blame. It's just an acknowledged fact. And so we have, we've had hearings on what it takes to really do proper forest management. I want to, so HR 2 is a measure that I have, Moving Forward Act on the House's infrastructure, that I think we ought to talk about with this subcommittee. I want to work with the subcommittee chair and members here to build back better forward and include all of the above approach in terms of using all of the water management tools in our water toolbox because of climate change and the drought conditions we're facing. I'd like to ask two quick questions, Mr. Kepin and Mr. Zimmer, before Ms. Zimmer, before my time's ended. You both pointed in your testimonies the importance of a need for all above approach in dealing with these challenges. They include habitat restoration, storage infrastructure, increasing funding and water smart programs, conveyance facilities, and infrastructure, and you noted the WIN Act. Could you please elaborate on these points and why are they necessary to achieve our sustainability goals? Ms. Zimmer and then Mr. Kepin, quickly.
Thank you, Representative Costa. And yes, just to reiterate, as you said, it's an all of the above approach that's needed to address the range of problems presented by both climate resilience, by economic recovery, and tribal sovereignty. And I think all of those solutions are required at once. And I'll turn over my remaining time to Dan.
Thanks, Laura. Well, Mr. Costa, our at Family Farm Alliance, we've long advocated that it's a suite of supply enhancement projects coupled with demand management. I mean, my experience has been there's never one silver bullet, so you got to look at it all. That's the simple answer.
Right. Well, and in doing so, I mean, we have to look at what's worked in the past. I think we've had some innovative both public-private partnerships, working with environmental groups. And we know some of them that have taken place with success in Oregon and in California. And I think we need to build on those clearly. And the chairman and I have talked about getting together and doing just that. So I want to thank the chairman and subcommittee members for your time and courtesy, and let's get to work.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. And we had some broadband interruptions in the first part of your time. If you want to submit anything in writing to make sure we get the first part of your statements into the record, we're happy to accommodate that. With that, we're going to go to Mr. Fulcher. The gentleman from Idaho is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Betts. And of the many tragedies of this pandemic, one has been not being able to see the smiling face of our chairman. And so to see that happy smiling face of Chairman Huffman is a delight. So pleased to see that again. Like many states, water is an absolute lifeblood for Idaho. And we have that same struggle with aging water infrastructure systems. And I would like to ask Mr. Keppen a couple of questions if he would yield. So Mr. Keppen, to that end, we've got this problem, and federal funding, as you point out, is needed, but it's not always dependable. We can't always know for sure where it's going to be predictable and sustainable. And some of the water districts have looked at ownership of some of those federal facilities and have gone down that path. And I'm speaking specifically of the Minidoka project in southern Idaho, which has been successful. And I wanted to just mention that to you and get your input. Is there further interest amongst your membership for title transfers like that that happened in the Minidoka project, southern Idaho?
Yeah, well, thank you, Congressman, for that question. Family Farm Alliance, way before I came on board 16 years ago, was really involved in trying to get some of these title transfers facilitated. And at the time, as you all know on this subcommittee, I believe, every single transfer proposal, be it 10 acres or 50,000 acres, had to go through Congress and be blessed by Congress. And so here in the last year and a half, 2 years, the Dingell Act provided some authority that said for certain types of simplified transfers, you don't have to go to Congress if the criteria are met. And then also in the last administration, the secretary issued an order that set up a process to really sort of get these things going, the uncontroversial types of transfers. And so we saw a huge improvement here in the last year and a half or so. I think before these new authorities were put in place, it was taking we're doing about 1.2 transfers per year, something like that. Last year, I think there was 6 or 7 that were done under this new facilitated process. So I hope that continues with the new administration. It's going to be something that we definitely are advocating for. And at some point, it might be interesting to see how transfers are being executed in a couple of years with some oversight from this subcommittee too.
Thank you for that. And just as a follow-up, you mentioned the WIN Act, and we've got the Anderson Dam Ranch project, the raise project in Idaho. That actually, the 6-foot raise, that actually was approved. That got the January 1 deadline. It actually made that, but there are other projects that did not. And so what's, from your perspective, what is going to happen to those projects that did not meet that January 21 deadline?
Yeah, it's a concern. We've got a couple in California that are in that boat too. I think those projects will remain feasible if we don't get the WIN Act extension, but they may be in limbo in terms of construction. And already, I think there's been millions of dollars spent on those projects. So that's my concern.
Other stakeholders, I believe, have expressed interest in utilizing that money. Does Reclamation have any other authorities there that available to stakeholders for new projects?
I'm not an attorney. To me, the WIN Act seems like it's the the most well-known. It's sort of proven over the last couple of years, and that should be the logical one to push forward. Reclamation may have other authorities when it comes to storage, but offhand, I can't really think of any.
Right. All right, Dan, thank you. Thank you for your input. Thank you for what you do. And I'm about
Thanks, sir.
out of time. So I want to just, one quick question for Ms. Zeimer, if at all possible. First of all, thank you, Ms. Zeimer, for your help. In the last Congress, you helped us with the Aquifer Recharge Flexibility Act, and just want to make sure you're still on board. Will you commit to working with us to make sure that reclamation implements the authorities that are granted to them? Ms. Zeimer.
Representative Fulcher, Trout Unlimited has really appreciated both working with your office and Senator Simpson's office on that Aquifer Recharge bill, along with Senator Risch. And absolutely, TU is a committed partner to making
Right.
sure that project goes implemented well and sets an example for the rest of the West.
Great. Thank you so much for your help. And once again, to the rest of those on the panel, Ranking Member Bentz, Chairman Huffman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Fulcher, and it's good to see your smiling face as well. Just keep dropping off all those Idaho potato products once a year, and we're going to be on very good terms.
We're on a mission to save Mr. Potato Head. We got to save Mr. Potato Head. We're working at it.
I thought you might be interested in that. We're going to recognize the gentleman from Southern California, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair Huffman. Thank you for your leadership. It's great to be back on the subcommittee, and thanks for holding this timely and important hearing today. As we know, the President just signed the American Rescue Plan, which we passed in the House yesterday. So we've addressed pandemic relief, and help is on the way. We see a light at the end of the tunnel, and now we're going to turn to the Build Back Better infrastructure plan that President Biden and Vice President Harris campaigned on last year. Build Back Better means creating jobs by improving our infrastructure and addressing the climate crisis, both by reducing emissions and making our communities more resilient. And in North San Diego County and South Orange County, where I represent, that's inclusive of key coastal resilience infrastructure and drought proofing our water supply. I am very pleased that the subcommittee is already thinking about the role we can play in the infrastructure package, including these important elements for Southern California. With that, I'll turn to my questions, and I wanted to begin with Ms. Zeimer. Last Congress, I introduced the Desalination Development Act, which authorizes a grant program to support desal projects, which would help provide largely drought-proof water supplies for communities like those in my district. In addition to investing $260 million into desalination projects, the bill would prioritize the best projects that are more protective of coastal ecosystems and that maximize the use of renewable energy. As we all know, Southern California has historically been reliant on water imported from Northern California, and we appreciate our friends in Northern California, and the Colorado River. Climate change has contributed to historically dry conditions in the Colorado River Basin, which has been in drought for now more than 2 decades. Ms. Zeimer, how can largely drought-proof water projects like reuse and desalination help communities like mine, which rely on imported water as part of our local water supply portfolio, to prepare for the more frequent and severe droughts brought on by a changing climate?
Representative Levin, that's an excellent question. And I think you have identified why it's so important to have, as you say, drought-proof new water supplies, especially for metropolitan areas. As your bill and the support in that technology for desalination shows, as you mentioned, reduced energy inputs, relying on green energy and addressing the brine produced by desalination. There's been great progress in all of those, particularly creating desalination methods that require less energy inputs. And that, coupled with reuse and recycling, create new water supplies that do not rely on those surface sources that are likely to get more scarce over time, and that also compete with both ag use as well as the use of imperiled ecosystems. So it's an excellent path forward for our municipal water supplies, and thank you for your efforts.
Thank you, Ms. Zeimer. Earlier this month, the Bureau of Reclamation awarded funding to 10 projects for advanced water treatment research and development to improve desalination technologies. And the Bureau of Reclamation's Desalination and Water Purification Research Program invests in technologies that can make water more affordable for communities and increase resilience to climate change. Ms. Ziemer, how could additional investments in advanced technologies improve water availability across the West?
As you said, not only with the municipal supply side of desalination, reuse, and conservation, but water technologies are helping with soil moisture monitoring, with precision application of agricultural water, of managing both reservoir operations as well as individual diversions. And as Dan Keppen mentioned, in the omnibus, the advances in projecting water supply with greater accuracy of forecasting both melt off and atmospheric conditions. And all of those are key ingredients.
Thank you so much. Captain Majewski, I'll turn to you with the time I have left. Your work with veterans on coastal restoration projects is really inspiring, and expanding job opportunities for veterans is a priority of mine on my subcommittee, my work on the Veterans Affairs Committee. Is there a potential to scale or formalize the coastal restoration work you've done with veterans through collaboration with federal agencies?
Thanks for that question. I appreciate it. Sure. There's plenty of opportunity here. Active support in collaboration through the service branches themselves or through the VA can be helpful and could provide those opportunities and to take this to scale. I believe there's been cooperative agreements in regions of our country drawing on active duty personnel as well to provide skills training. We look forward to those partnerships and working with our veterans. And we are working with certain agencies now too. Someone mentioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program. We partner with that, and where we're able to have funding again for continuing our U.S. Veterans Program. So lots of opportunity to really train these veterans and give them, basically the way I said in my testimony, give them time to acclimate to civilian life and maybe find a new career path.
Thank you, Captain. Appreciate all you do for veterans. I'm out of time and I'll yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Representative Boebert is next. The gentlelady from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Bentz. This week, I introduced the Western Water Security Act, which protects private property rights. It upholds state water law and prohibits federal takings of private water rights. Out West water absolutely is our lifeblood, like you have heard stated so many times today. Water security is vital for agriculturalists, outdoor recreation, resource development, infrastructure, and of course, our local communities. Mr. Keppen, in your testimony, you rightly pointed out that the federal government's approach to water policy has typically been a one-size-fits-all approach. That doesn't work for rural communities like mine. Can you elaborate on this point?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and by the way, thank you for introducing that bill. It's legislation that we've supported in previous Congresses too. But our philosophy has been the best decisions in all resource issues come from the local level, in collaboration with federal and state agencies and as many diverse parties as possible. That's been my experience, is that's where the sort of the best solutions come from. And so a lot of times if folks in DC are coming out with sort of mandates that are intended to be applied across the board, it doesn't always work. So the more flexible policies that you have that definitely recognize the importance of the local producers and in the community are the lead to the solutions that are the best in my view.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Keppen. You also talked about the need for new water storage and why that is so important for the West. You also testified that bureaucratic permitting and approval processes are preventing important projects from moving forward. What else could Congress do to assist with increasing water storage and allowing important projects to move forward?
Again, just the fact that we're talking about storage is really encouraging. 10 years ago, that wasn't really the case. And again, talking about it, funding it is one thing. I am concerned that we got a lot of dollars in the pipeline right now to get some of these projects going, and if we don't extend WIN-ACT, for example, what happens to those projects and the investment that's already been put forward? And then also, we just want to make sure that as these projects are being developed, especially at this time where I think getting people to work is going to help us recover from COVID and get our economy back on track, we want to make sure that we're trying to facilitate the permitting processes as best that we can associated with those projects instead of making it more complicated.
Thank you. And as you know, Colorado just came out of one of the worst wildfire seasons in the state's history. As we look forward to the upcoming wildfire season, wildfire mitigation is necessary and it's multifaceted. With so much federal land in my district, more than 55%, and then the local, state, and federal officials work together on forest and watershed restoration and fire mitigation efforts. It is absolutely vital that on-the-ground management is allowed to improve forest health. This management can also work hand in hand to protect water supplies for the benefit of the local communities. Without active management, our national forests are tinderboxes ready to blow, as you know, and if we don't manage our forests, Mother Nature will continue to manage it for us. Mr. Keppen, can you please discuss how active management of our nation's forests improves water quality and benefits these local communities?
Sure. Well, my father actually, like Ranking Member Westman, was a forester. He spent his entire career working for the Forest Service in timber management. And, as you've just said, we know that mechanical thinning, controlled burns, and other forest management measures can be used to reduce the threat of catastrophic wildfires, which you've seen in the last 10 years that really caused some problems, especially, afterwards where debris and silt can enter the streams. We also know, especially in your neck of the woods, Congresswoman, that vegetation management can also increase water supplies. There's studies that are coming out on the Platte that show that. And there's also studies that are coming out of California, I believe UC Merced, that are demonstrating that. So really, there's multiple ways to sort of tackle the water quality issue when you're dealing with forest management. But the big one to me is, you can reduce the fuel load that contributes to these catastrophic fires that can increase the risk of landslides and silting up the streams.
I couldn't have said it better myself. There's certainly laws and regulatory hurdles that are preventing active forest management. Some of my friends on the other side of the aisle claim that active forest management can continue in wilderness areas, and then we will not have increased wildfire threats by locking up millions of acres in the West with new wilderness designation. Do you believe that that's true? If we are unable to...
The gentlelady's time is expired, unfortunately, but we will accept written questions that can be forwarded to these witnesses to expand on any other questions you might have.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Keppen.
All right. Thank you. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Brownlee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I think this is my first committee hearing, and I think it's a great topic. I think every subcommittee in Congress across the board should be having a similar hearing to this. It's a great way to start understanding that we are going to be moving forward with a very significant infrastructure bill. So just to follow up on the line of questioning that was just happening, I wanted to address a question to Dr. Mosley. I represent Ventura County. We don't have, we have forests surrounding our district, but we've had some severe fires, but forests haven't had anything really to do with it. So I wanted you to sort of expand on what can counties like mine do to preserve drinking water supplies? Clearly this is going to be more of a problem if we don't do anything about wildfires, and they're just going to become more common and extreme. So what is sort of the infrastructure investments that we can make to protect our drinking water supplies?
Thank you, Congresswoman. That is a really critical question. We do focus a lot on fuels reduction in forests as one of the ways to change fire behavior. But in communities like yours, and my family members have evacuated from fires in your district, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think one of the things in addition to focusing on the fuels treatment in the forest, we need to think about how to have communities in non-forested fire-prone landscapes and in areas such as where I live, where thinning won't change fire behavior of the forests.
And in those cases, what we really need to be focused on is on community preparedness. We need to make sure that homes are fire safe, that people know what their evacuations routes are, that they are really very prepared to leave and come back safely. And that we're also going to really have to be focused on how we harden the infrastructure around our water supplies and really do the post-fire recovery quickly and efficiently. We sort of been watching the big dramatic landslides on Highway 1 in California, which has also sort of been, it was also not in a forested landscape and a fire-prone ecosystem. So I think we really do have to reach for different tools in the other non-forested landscapes, just as you suggest.
Thank you for that. My next question is to Ms. Zeimer. You mentioned in your written testimony that you thought that the 2009 stimulus bill, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, we know it as ARA, provided a good template for how conservation and restoration programs can get people back to work, as well as certainly improving our environment. And I was just wondering, if you could share any lessons learned from the 2009 stimulus package that we should be considering as we look towards an infrastructure package in this Congress.
Representative Brownlee, an excellent question. And I think our biggest lesson learned from the 2009 package, especially with a decade more of the climate change trends expressing themselves in water and fire in the West, drought and wildfire, is that we need to do more across all of those areas. The drought-proof new supplies for municipalities, the watershed and coastal restoration, and the investment in water delivery infrastructure for irrigation. And the need is great. The 2009 was a good start, and we need more.
Terrific. And I have a little bit more time, not much, but Mr. Keppen, I wanted to ask you, you've talked about, you've been looking at the impacts of climate change on irrigated ag now for a long time, and I appreciate that. And I believe that the federal government needs to make more investments, around protecting in our water infrastructure and protecting our water supplies. You mentioned a whole bunch of them. I'm just, if you could just generally tell me, and I probably will have to follow up with you later because I'm running out of time, but I'm sort of interested in what you think farmers are doing now, because I feel like my farmers in Ventura County are doing actually a lot. And I would be interested in that, but I see my time is out, so we'll have to have another conversation.
If you want to tackle that in
later.
15 or 20 seconds, we can allow that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's a great question. Actually, I'd be happy to lay that out in maybe a response to a QFR in more detail. But there's a lot of great things going on, and it's done in different ways depending on the locality. So California, to me, is sort of a model for what's being done on water use efficiency for sure.
Yeah,
I can provide more detail and a follow-up.
All right, we're going to go to Ranking Member Benz for the next 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for some great testimony. I'm going to start with I don't know if it's Zeimer or Zimmer. I apologize for not knowing the proper way to pronounce your name, but here's the question. I've heard a lot about desalination and how it might be a solution, but I've heard also the cost per acre foot's like $2,000–$3,000. Can you put in perspective for us whether or not desalination is a true way to adapt?
Excellent question, Ranking Member Bentz, and your focus on cost effectiveness is spot on. I do think, however, that for municipal water supply that is drought proof, as desalination is, there is a place in the portfolio for that technology, especially as we begin to understand how to do that technology better. But you're also correct that that is not a silver bullet, and that an entire portfolio approach is required to meet those challenges.
Thank you. And moving to Dr. Mosley, and I want to thank Dr. Mosley for her excellent work in Oregon and her extreme patience putting up with collaboratives there in the years of trying to address the incredible challenge presented by federal regulatory frameworks. And so, Dr. Mosley, you talked about the challenge that we're facing when it comes to our forests, and it was also mentioned by Congresswoman Boebert. But can you put in perspective for just a moment what we're facing? I mean, how many millions of acres do we have of timber, and what do we need to do to try to address this in a way that actually is capable of being scaled up?
Thank you, Ranking Member Benson. I really appreciate your kind words. I think there's some sort of new estimates that I think are going to be coming out fairly soon here that something like 50 to 60 million acres of forested lands in the American West. Those are targeted acres to really improve fire behavior and restore fire-adapted ecosystems are necessary for treatment on National Forest Service lands. And I think, so that's a really, really large amount of acres. And I mentioned in my testimony, we have in Oregon right now, 2.2 of those million acres ready for treatment because they're through the NEPA process and are just awaiting funding. So those are the sort of multi-billion-dollar, probably decadal or multi-decadal project to really turn the corner on fuels treatments. And I do think that your question here is really getting to the question of how do we scale up. And I think one of the things we know, right, is that there's a tension between sometimes in national forest management, you go slow to go fast. And so we can't lose track of the building at the local scale, the agreement to get projects done on the ground. But we know that we need a lot more investment in the resources to execute the projects, to have the staffing necessary at the agencies to plan those projects and get them all through the environmental analysis. So while I don't love to throw money at problems, it's certainly the case that we need more investment as the Forest Service's budget has been increasingly taken up with fire suppression.
And as a follow-up to this, we know right now that a 2x4, if you go to Home Depot, costs more than I have ever seen a 2x4 cost. And thus there is real money to be made in turning some of our forests into 2x4s. And it seems to me when you're looking at a problem of such a massive scale, we're going to have to employ the private enterprise in some fashion. So would you be recommending that as if I recall correctly, the way the collaborative works is you do bring a private industry into play?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are some landscapes, particularly in your district, where there's an opportunity to do fuels treatment and take logs down the road to the mills. In many places, including John Day and other places. And that's a really critical piece of the puzzle. I think it's also really important to realize that in some parts of the West, there isn't really any mill infrastructure left, or the material that's available is too small to be that needs to be thinned is too small to be processed. So like we've been talking about in the water, all of the above strategy, we need an all of the above strategy in forest management that includes merchantable timber, biomass energy, and treatments that will not lead to removal.
Thank you. I say I'm out of time, so I won't ask the other 32 questions that I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We would welcome 32 written questions, and we'll get you answers. Thank you to the ranking member. We'll now recognize Congresswoman Dingell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz, for convening this hearing to discuss the multifaceted impact of conservation priorities on our nation's environment, economy, and ecosystem. It's important to recognize that the conservation issues under this subcommittee's jurisdiction intersect with many of the problems our country is facing right now, from addressing climate change to providing environmental justice and creating jobs. Thoughtful conservation policies can help solve many of these challenges. It's my hope that our discussion today forms the basis for future action, both as we look forward to a future recovery package and other bipartisan efforts in the current Congress. Dr. Mosley, the Endangered Species Act enables and funds habitat restoration and protection programs. And you spoke in your testimony about a particular effort to revive salmon species throughout Oregon using a collaborative multi-stakeholder approach. In your experience, are there ways that we can better structure or make accessible funding from multiple agencies and programs to better facilitate these sorts of collaborative approaches to conservation?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. You know, I think I would say there's two key ingredients. One is that it's really important to have the funding available to facilitate the collaborative process, not just the projects on the ground. Because if you don't have that glue, then it can be really hard, particularly for communities that are stretched up economically to come together. And so tiny programs like the Forest Services collaborative stewardship program that it's been something where they've worked with the National Forest Foundation to fund has really been a key ingredient there. So I think supporting the collaborative capacity is one thing. The second thing I think that's really important is we look at funding programs that our temptation I think is sometimes to make them very targeted and very narrow, and then it can become quite difficult for communities to apply them to their specific circumstances. So to the extent that we can think about broadening out the authorities to allow for the funding to be applied to specific circumstances that are locally relevant. That's really important. We live in such a diverse nation that it's really easy to end up with these very narrowly focused projects that only apply in a few places. And that can be really challenging and time consuming for communities to sort of dig through them all and figure out what the right secret sauce is for their place.
So let me sort of build on that. So your example is the salmon revival through watershed restoration that's specific to the Pacific Northwest. But do you see additional opportunities to apply this same collaborative, holistic approach to other endangered species protection policies and restoration projects? And I'm thinking like the Great Lakes and in the Great Lakes region.
I really do. And while I'm not familiar with the Great Lakes, I can point to some other landscapes in the West. I was thinking this morning of the Blackfoot watershed in Western Montana, where ranchers have come together to do forest restoration, rangeland restoration, and also really manage and sort of figure out how they live with grizzly bears and wolves. And through this real collaborative process that includes the land management agencies, ranchers, and other community members, they've really sort of said, okay, we live in this landscape with these predators, and we're going to really figure out how we live with them. And so if you can do it with grizzlies and wolves, you got to be able to do it with almost anything.
So that's true. Could these efforts have a broader benefit to habitat resiliency?
I'm sorry, can you say this? Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Could these efforts have a broader benefit to habitat resiliency?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you see in the sort of more sophisticated collaborations is a focus on integrated restoration. So they don't just go in and work on salmon, or they don't just go work on fire. They say, hey, look, roads, fire, salmon, healthy rangeland. This is all important for our place to really be functioning well. And so I think one of the great things about these place-based collaboratives is that they take an integrated approach that ends up addressing species and having great roads for recreation and access and all of a single piece. And so that's one of the things I think is most powerful, is that integrated approach.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Chairman, with 19 seconds left, I'm going to yield back to you.
Well, thank you for the gift of those 19 seconds. We will now go over to Ranking Member Westerman. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to the witnesses. As I said, I spent a lot of time looking at your testimony and making notes. And this may be a little bit of a different approach, but I actually noted what I think are the positive things and common ground from your testimony. Just want to do a really quick recap of that. Ms. Zimmer, you included a table that shows that 39.7 jobs are created for every $1 million spent on forest land and watershed restoration. That table had 21 line items in it, and that was the highest return on investment out of that table. Captain Medeski, you said that a healthy economy depends on a healthy environment. I've said that many times myself. And if I may have some literary freedom, I would also add or make the case that a healthy environment depends on a healthy economy, that the two go hand in hand. And Captain, you also made a strong case for some natural infrastructure in its appropriate application and shared some good examples of that. Dr. Mosley, I found your testimony particularly full of good ideas and pertinent data. Right off the bat, you stated something about 80% of drinking water comes from forested lands and 20% of that's from U.S. Forest Service lands. More people need to understand that. More people need to understand that nexus between forestry and water. You provided several good examples of collaborative forest management projects to improve forest resiliency in watersheds in New Mexico and Colorado. You made the case for a real issue that we face in restoring the workforce and the supply chains to do the management that needs to be done in our rural areas. And you also talked about the decline of natural resources and manufacturing jobs in rural communities. I believe this is the whole reason for this hearing's title, which is Building Back Better. We're having to rebuild back because of regulatory policies in the past that literally destroyed rural economies. And I hope we're smarter now as we address these issues. Mr. Keppen, on top of the fact that you're a fellow PE and your brother's a fellow forester, your testimony was excellent, and there's too many good things in it for me to elaborate on in the time that we have. So with all these common goals and the central theme of the importance of water to the West and the importance of forest to water, the environment and the climate, I conclude that we should focus our attention on healthy forests and strong rural economies as a top priority while we support many of the great ideas that have been discussed today. And my question to the whole panel is that plan too simplistic? And is it not the largest scale and most pragmatic action we can take to rebuild what we've broken? It seems to me like the forest is where the real bang for the buck is.
Any witnesses want to tackle that?
I will. Yes, sir. Well, great observations, Ranking Member, and thank you for all your work that you've done. Our organization sets priorities every year, and this is the first year that we weren't able to meet face to face because of COVID. We did it by Zoom, and that's one of our top priorities is to really focus on the forest health, and sort of building on some of the themes that were in my testimony. And I think there's opportunities to do it. I know Senator Bennett from Colorado is seriously looking at this right now, and he spoke at our annual conference a couple weeks ago. There's opportunities to get rural economies clicking, clean these forests up, all kinds of opportunities for collaborative work, like what we do with Trout Unlimited, for example. And it's also tied to the water component. The healthier these forests are, the better our overall hydrology is going to be. So it's definitely one of our top priorities. We share that with you.
Dr. Mosley, you have any comments on that?
I guess I would just add, or maybe agree that, really forests are a critical piece of particularly in the West, and that forests and rangelands are connected to rivers. And so we really need to think of it as of a piece into the agricultural lands. And so I think you're onto something here. We really need to think through how we focus on this, an integrated approach that really thinks about water and forests at the same time.
And I would just throw in on that excellent question, supporting everything that both Professor Mosley and Dan said, but also raising the point that what you have pointed out also supports that emphasis on collaboration and multi-stakeholder projects, which gets at these solutions that do multiple things at the same time. Forest health, resiliency of water supply, resiliency and reliability of agricultural water supply. We can do projects that do all things at the same time.
I agree, and I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
And I thank the ranking member. We'll now recognize my friend from the beautiful state of Hawaii, Mr. Case, for the next 5 minutes. There you go, Ed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for recognizing my beautiful state. This question is to Captain Majeski. So yes, I am from Hawaii, and in Hawaii we do oceans, we do coastlines, we define littoral, and we're very proud of that. And by the way, for my colleagues on the committee's edification, I actually added this up as we were talking here. We've got 22 members on the committee, and 18 of us represent coastal states. which is on a very bipartisan basis. It's very even, and so there should be a lot of action that we can do in that department. And in Hawaii, we rank number 4 in terms of the length of our coastline. Mr. Young eclipses all of us, Florida and California after us. But there's a lot of synergy that we can develop in terms of our oceans and our coastlines, it seems to me. And so in that spirit, Captain, we're talking about resilience of our coastlines, of our littoral environment, not for a lot of different reasons. And you mentioned some of these in your testimony. We're talking about it from the perspective of the health of our oceans. We're talking about it from the perspective of the preservation of habitats that depend on the littoral environment. We're talking about it from the perspective of tourism. Many of us are reliant upon the oceans for tourism, and our tourist-related resources are under mortal threat from climate change and from non-point source pollution and from a lot of other very specific reasons. And so my question to you is, what specific federal programs do you think give us the most bang for our buck in terms of coastal resiliency? Where should we really focus in terms of preserving our coastlines reasonably? And if you think that our federal programs are insufficient from that perspective, so it's not just a matter of money, it's a matter of the actual functioning of those programs. How would you like those programs to be changed?
Well, thanks for that question. So where I do a majority of my work is in Delaware Bay, and we strongly rely on ecotourism in that area. So much like in Hawaii, the natural elements that we have and that we can maintain and sustain, they lead to a pretty big industry. I do things mainly through living shorelines. We do a lot of beach restoration, and that's for the horseshoe crab and the federally listed red knot. The horseshoe crab, of course, is a pharmaceutical for lysate, but its eggs are so important to the shorebirds that visit Delaware Bay. Delaware Bay is that epicenter for where the federally listed red knot comes. So the programs that we've been working with, we work through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for funding. And these are all funded projects. For Delaware Bay, it's been a little bit easier because it has evolved more and more as we're becoming more programmatic. Getting the permits ahead of time, getting regional permits, stuff like that, to really kind of make sure that we're positioned in a way that when funding does become available, we're shovel ready to protect those resources and protect that economy that drives from there.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between operational federal funding for habitat preservation purposes and infrastructure funding for capital improvements that are reasonably designed for resilience. And coastal engineering is giving us new approaches all of the time. I think what I'm struggling with in my own mind is if we're talking about long-term, big picture, environmentally friendly coastal resiliency that doesn't actually destroy beaches. Sometimes I feel like we haven't quite gotten the answer to that yet, either in terms of the federal programs and/or the types of projects that we actually want to fund off of those federal programs. Do you have thoughts on that?
Sure, I do. We excuse me, we look at every program we can, whether it's a habitat restoration project, but we promote it through resiliency to have that project, or if it's ecological uplift of that project and we go after more of the biological, ecological components for funding. It all depends, but they provide, these projects provide all these different aspects and different results. It's just how we put that forward to say, the Living Shorelines Initiative, we can connect these living shorelines together. Pretty soon you have a huge project. We can go and do salt marsh restoration. That's critical for carbon sequestration. I mean, my understanding from what I've read is salt marsh actually takes in 2 to 3 times more carbon than it would in a mature forest, a tropical mature forest. So that's interesting to know that habitat's here and people want to visit that. So at least in Delaware Bay, especially where I do a lot of work, people come to just a bird and to see things like that. So, I mean, maybe there's a program through that. We look at every stone.
Okay. Thank you very much, Captain.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. case, we'll now recognize the gentleman from Alaska, the Dean of the House, the guy with the most coastline of any of our districts, as we were just reminded, our friend Don Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And for you smaller states, we do have the most coastline of all the United States, not just statewide. So just keep that in mind. I'm interested in this subject, but I want a question to Mr. Kaplan first. Mr. Kaplan, there was a number of administrative changes made in the National Environmental Policy Act and Endangered Species Act in the last few years. What's the importance of these changes to farmers, your ranchers, and the communities which you represent?
Well, we certainly spent significant time working with our membership and our water managers and attorneys from around the West over the last 4 years, preparing comments on a lot of those administrative changes that came out of the previous administration. Mostly we focused on NEPA, ESA, and Clean Water Act. And I guess, Congressman Young, I won't get into all the details and get into the weeds, but in general, we supported those efforts. We thought that they helped provide certainty, clarity, and common sense reforms to how these laws are administered. And you know, they were very big issues for our membership. So we're comfortable, and I know there's a lot of interest, and I hear a lot in the media about efforts to maybe, you know, turn some of those rules around. And I just hope that everybody will take a close look and recognize that some of these changes that were made could actually allow these infrastructure projects to move quicker. So in general, I think the laws weren't really affected. They were actually improved in how they're implemented, and they work for the benefit of people, species, and projects in the West.
Well, I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I want to keep one in mind. We're talking about the impoundment of water, all the other parts of the water system, the importance, and I happen to agree with that. We also have to start thinking about how we use water outside of the agricultural arena. The municipalities use the water very poorly. They waste a lot of water. Every human being wastes water. I used to live on 100 gallons of water a week. And by the way, I took a bath too. And now an average house is spending maybe 1,800 gallons of water. And that's just nonsense. We have to re-educate them. Impoundment's crucially important. California, Mr. Chairman, the Auburn Dam. And that brings me to another point. We talk about the issues of water, the environment, and climate change. The best way you can change the climate is get rid of the lawyers, because they file suits on everything that tries to happen. And you're a lawyer, Mr. Chairman, but everything that happens to happen, there's a suit filed and nothing occurs. And I've watched this over the years. You know, I happen to think there's enough water molecules in the atmosphere now there has been in the past. We have not impounded and we misused them. And usually it's because of a suit. I was chairman, we had suits and during everything that happened, there's a lawsuit. So I just suggest respectfully, water is the big issue. A lot of people thought it was peak oil, but water is a big issue. We better learn how to use it, how to impound it, how to distribute it, and actually have the watershed a little greater. So a lot of the members already talked about it, but I thank you for your efforts, Mr. Kaplan, and I really thank the panel. I don't agree with some of you, but I will say respectfully, this is the big issue. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. And your get rid of the lawyers solution is very Shakespearean. I appreciate that. Let's go to Congressman Lowenthal from Southern California. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really enjoying this oversight hearing. You know, one of the things that struck me and I'll get back to the specific questions, that struck me in the hearing memo was that how that it talked about new well-designed dams and storage projects can offset or avoid the harmful environmental effects that many 20th century dams caused. And talking about the needed infrastructure that we're going to do, it struck me with all those discussions that I used to have here in the California legislature about the real dangers of hydropower and dams on what we can, what happened. So my question really is to, let me just get my question out here, is really to Ms. Zimmer, but also maybe Dr. Mosley. I heard the concept of fish-friendly hydropower being mentioned, and I want to expand upon that because, as we all know, dam projects and hydropower are not all equal. And broadly, hydropower is not wild and scenic friendly rivers. And, you know, we're talking about a critical issue. So it's not wild and scenic friendly, and it frequently is not fish friendly. I would like you to speak to me and how we need to make sure that we're responsibly developing and advancing the most effective hydropower projects or dams that don't cause significant harm to ecosystems and fish and wildlife.
Representative Lowenthal, that's an excellent point. And you really underscore that to face our water challenges effectively, we need modern solutions. And those are solutions that integrate across multiple disciplines and solve multiple problems at the same time. There are excellent hydropower solutions out there. The Farmers Conservation Alliance, one of our Western Ag and Conservation Coalition members, is a pioneer in fish-friendly, high return on investment hydropower that's part of a system-wide irrigation optimization effort. So in that hydropower is in line on existing canals that are being either pressurized or piped, but it's part of a whole system review that makes it right-sized and is part of an overall effort. Similarly, as you point out, hydropower on every dam is not necessarily a good investment. Those investments are going to be best when the dam is also addressing legacy impacts, and some of that hydropower revenue goes to making a long-term infrastructure investment that's going to withstand the test of time.
Anyone else, Dr. Mosley, anything that you can add?
Sure, I'll just add, I think that these are really, both addressing them system-wide and then on a case-by-case basis. That is, you might have one solution on one particular dam where the thing to do is to, rebuild, to create fish passage and to really modernize the hydropower. In another dam, it's reached the end of its life. It's not serving the irrigators anymore. It doesn't, it doesn't really work, and you can get to a win-win-win by removal. And the two examples, I'm thinking of two examples in Representative Bentz's district with different outcomes that were broadly supported. So I really think that there's a diversity of solutions depending on the specifics of the situation.
Well, I'm glad we've had anybody else this discussion, because we really haven't talked about the potential negative impacts of doing this as a project. We've talked about some of the benefits, and I hear that, but I also want to hear that once we start building dams of any kind or hydropower, as effective as it could be as a renewable, it also has some negative impacts too. And so I want to hear more about that if anybody else, but I'll contact you later on. So I yield back now.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from American Samoa, another beautiful district represented on our subcommittee, Ms. Radaway.
Thank you. Talofa, and good afternoon. I want to thank Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Betts for holding this hearing, and thank you all for testifying today. I'd like to yield my time to the Ranking Member. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Radewigan, for that yield. And this gives me a chance to go back to my 32 questions, which I deeply appreciate. But I'm going to ask a question that does apply perhaps to the insular countries, states, almost territories that we have, and it goes like this: if we're talking about resilience, we're talking about change, and we're talking about how best to address that change. And that necessarily means how we're going to prioritize that which we are going to be doing. And so we heard just a week ago, that it's projected. We're going to see water levels increasing and making it just survival in those spaces incredibly challenging. So I would like just to try to put a burden on each one of our witnesses and have them tell me how you suggest that this committee recommend prioritization of the challenges that resilience presents. Tell me, should we put together a template, a checklist, a lottery? What are we going to be doing when it comes to finding the money to address the many issues we've discussed today and the ones we discussed last week? And I will start just because I'm mean with Dan Keppen, and I know him well, and he's an engineer. He should be able to answer this easily.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, my new congressman. Well, I think we got to kind of look at what we're facing right now in this country, and I'm concerned that we're gonna be facing some pretty tough economic times in another couple of years when some of this economic relief isn't there anymore. I'm already sort of seeing it in agriculture, so I think we need to prioritize in terms of first of all, best bang for the buck, given the fact that we may have limited dollars. I think we need to be looking at what are the kind of projects that could be built that are going to put people to work and lead to some of these solutions. And I honestly do believe, from our standpoint, it's got to be a combination of looking at the Western landscape, the forests, and coupling that with some man-made infrastructure fixes. That's sort of our priorities. I'm not sure I've got criteria for that, Congressman Bentz, but our testimony definitely lays out some ideas.
Let's go to Alec.
Thanks. So again, I'm going to go more towards my state and the coastal environments that we are involved in. And the funding that we need, or the money appropriated that we need, really helps communities. We're having communities now, due to sea level rise and climate change, like in Barnegat Bay, where I have a big project right now to build 8 series of oyster reefs. It's a water quality grant that I have received, but in actuality, I'm providing resilience to the shoreline. The shoreline, or the bay is winning an inward battle. And the bay now is on people's property lines and taking away retaining walls and things like that. And it's happening exponentially every year now. We're seeing even more and more. So really, either investing, I think, in that shoreline kind of a stabilization using nature-based infrastructures, or however you want to do it, is important, for the resiliency piece of it. We're seeing the same thing along our coastlines, just our dunes, and where we have, like I built a maritime forest, half-acre. This half-acre maritime forest really treats stormwater, but when a storm does come, like when we had Superstorm Sandy, if that forest was in place, it would have caught the sand that blew in from the beach into the coastal lake, which then cost millions of dollars to dredge. So again, it's a big picture, like we've been saying, but a lot of things need to be, looked at.
Thank you. Let's go to Dr. Mosley.
I think a common theme is emerging, which is that we need to focus on things that have multiple benefits: economic, ecological, and community, all at the same time.
And Laura.
And I would throw in on that we have a great example of just that approach with the implementation of the Yakima Integrated Plan in Eastern Washington, in terms of having cost-effective programs. It does 3 things. It's multi-stakeholder, so it's integrated across multiple considerations: agriculture, municipal, and fish and wildlife. They're pre-planned and integrated as a whole. So we have infrastructure, storage, and watershed restoration all working together. And there's a timeline for the implementation of those projects, so money can hit the ground in the Yakima in a very cost-effective and timely way to get people back to work and realize that benefit.
Thank you.
We're going to need to leave it there. Thanks for those answers. And we're going to go to another one of our coastal representatives from beautiful Florida. Representative Soto, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
So truth be told, Chairman, although we have a lot of coastline, none in my district.
You don't.
But I'm going to talk about coastline, so it was still a great segue. But I don't want the folks in the 9th to think I don't know every part of our district.
It's a redistricting year. It's a redistricting year, Darren. You never know how you're going to come out.
We'll leave that for another committee, Chairman. Thank you so much. And thank you for this hearing about building resilience for our economy, for our climate, and our ecosystems, which are really interchangeable, right, in so many ways, and connected. Attacks on our environment in Florida have been worsened by the climate crisis and by a huge increase in populations. We see more intense hurricanes because of climate change. We see stressed aquifers and water supply because of increasing populations. Flood control always is a major concern. We work closely with the Army Corps of Engineers. With rising seas, you see saltwater intrusion into our wastewater treatment and plumbing. And we're also trying to work to prevent red tide through nutrients going in the ocean and exacerbating this natural phenomenon. Part of increasing resiliency in many of these water systems will improve our water supply, preserve our wildlife, and protect recreation and tourism, which means the economy in Florida. In my district, we have the Northern Everglades. It starts just north of me and goes through the Kissimmee Chain of Lakes all the way down through to Lake Okeechobee and beyond to the traditional Everglades that many people are familiar with in South Florida. So finishing the Kissimmee River restoration, which is almost done, to clean water going into Lake Okeechobee, a key part of that. Finishing the dike around Lake Okeechobee to update water schedules and improve our conservation for both communities around the lake and south of the lake and north of the lake. Really critical. Also improving flood control and water storage in the Kissimmee Chain of Lakes, like Lake Tehopekaliga in my area, where we help store water so we don't overload Lake Okeechobee. Restoring many of Florida's natural springs, which have had some issues lately. And we've converted some of these flood control water bodies also to water storage. Recently, I was able to pass legislation in the Water Resource Development Act for Taylor Creek in Osceola County, which is used for water storage for flood control, to now be used for water storage as well. So we're able to do both at the same time. In Polk County, in our area, in Citrus Country, that also continues to be a big issue as we work with local governments there to create a new reservoir there. And Chairman, I hope we can this term pass our Restoring Resilient Reefs Act to help save the Great Florida Reef, along with reefs in Hawaii and other areas, which are under attack by warming seas, by wastewater releases, and be able to repropagate the reef with new coral. We could upgrade our water infrastructure to include both reducing wastewater discharges that pollute our oceans and reefs, along with greater resiliency to saltwater intrusion. The comprehensive Everglades restoration plan is also critical, storing and cleaning more water going into the Everglades to preserve America's sea of grass. These projects must be part of the Build Back Better infrastructure package we will be putting together later this spring. So thank you for putting this together. And I believe this presents a bipartisan opportunity to improve and restore water systems, create hydro energy, and to restore coastal regions. Captain Modjeski, as part of the American Recovery Act of 2009, we saw shovel-ready projects in coastal restoration, some of these other projects, put to work Americans who are trying to get back to work. Can we do this again with this infrastructure package we have coming up very soon with the economy the way it is?
Thank you for that question. I'll answer as best as I can. I think yes. I think the programs that we've had in the past in place have really worked. When I look back at, the 2009, there was like 152 restoration projects that were funded in it. It built amazing economy, amazing jobs, and it provided the goods and services that we need in this changing climate. So I definitely think that there's room for it, and I look forward to that opportunity to see it happen.
So there's a way that we can restore our economy and our environment through these key infrastructure projects. Isn't that correct?
I totally agree. Yes.
And Ms. Mosley, I know there's been some issues with a final rule strengthening wage protection and ensuring foreign temporary workers are not adversely affected. How do you view, Dr. Mosley, the final rule that just came out?
I'm not an immigration attorney. I think one of the things, let me sort of focus on the importance of the wage side of this rather than the immigration side of this. What I think is really critical, so many of these projects are subject to the Service Contract Act wages. And I think what we really need to be focused on is ensuring that workers are paid the wages that they're entitled to. And that really should happen regardless of their immigration status. on whether they're guest workers or citizens or have other statuses.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you very much. We're going to go a little further south to a member who definitely has a coastal district in Puerto Rico. Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try not to be repetitive here. My question will be to Captain Majeski. I saw that your bio notes that one of your first restoration projects was in the creation of artificial reef in Isla Verde in Puerto Rico. My first question should be, the funds that were used for that project were federal?
They were not. So these were private funds provided as mitigation to a fiber optic cable that was going through, basically being hand laid in between the patch rock reefs there. So what we did as mitigation is create an artificial reef, I think about 60 feet down, using some recycled concrete and things like that there. And I will say, when we were in Isla Verde, we happened to come across a queen conch, which they hadn't seen in 20 years, which was really great to see that through just being there and doing our research, we found a federally managed species that had not been seen in that area for a long time.
And actually, right now, after the hurricane, we got like the 100-year wave that created erosion in the whole island. And we managed to secure some resources to the Corps of Engineers for actually getting a study about beach erosion in the whole island. One of the issues, and the reason I make that question is, I don't know if you're familiar with, we got last year in the committee, the director of the Coastal Management Program and Coral Reef Conservation Management Program in Puerto Rico, and he was mentioning that the federal funding opportunities are rarely pursued by island jurisdictions, and where there are several reasons of the lack of capacity to develop specific components of the federal grants. Definitely is one of them, and I just wanted to make sure that as Puerto Rico, other territories or island jurisdictions are able to compete, right? I don't know if you got any recommendations in terms of improvement to those programs and to ensure that insular areas are not disadvantaged by the cumbersome federal grant making process.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have any recommendations at this time. I'd like to look into it more for you because I'm not as familiar with everything that you're talking about. But I could make recommendations once I get a little more information.
Thank you. And if you are or have been involved in with federal permitting process as well, and your experience in the private sector as well, if there are opportunities with that we can streamline or improve that process, feel free also to share those recommendations with us, because we are having those issues right now at the federal and the private sector on the island.
That I can provide a little bit on. So I'm heavily involved in all the permitting of these projects that I do with my staff. And we've evolved since Sandy with federal regulators, state regulators, and the locals, involving stakeholders early and often in these projects. This is how we've gotten regional permits for 2 counties for 10 years or 5-year, that's a renewable state permit. We got all the regulators in a room together. And we said, here's what we want to do. We need to do these types of projects for restoration and resiliency. How do we interpret NEPA to do these projects? And from there, the discussion started. And 6 months later, we've had permits in place that we can now use when funding becomes available, especially in Delaware Bay, which is beach restoration, vegetated berm restoration, and oyster reef restoration.
Thank you. I know that my time is running up, so I'll try to be brief and then submit many of the questions for the record. I'll go now with Dr. Keppen. One of the issues that in your testimony you were explaining the supply management problems faced by many Americans in the Western state, including the droughts, the need of federal government to invest in water infrastructure and other policies to mitigate those issues. And even when Puerto Rico is not a Western state, we can relate to that, right? We got many of those concerns. We long face water efficiency and reliability issues. And just to give you an example, 55% of our water, authority produced water, is lost in distribution. Mainly due to pipe ruptures, leakage, and aged infrastructure that now with the funds that are being secured are going to be, we'll try to get those fixed. We got in 2015 extreme drought conditions on the island that resulted in rationing for over 1.2 million people on the island. So one of my questions, and I know my time is expired, is based on your experience, can you briefly elaborate on how to invest in these water conservation measures and the Water Smart grant that we actually get that passed during the last Congress, and the eligibility for those 17 Western states and the non-continuous territories like Hawaii and Alaska that are now part of this legislation. And I will submit the rest of my questions for the record.
All right, if you could do that in about 20 seconds, I would welcome it now. Otherwise, we probably need to do that in a written follow-up.
Go ahead, please, and send me a question. I will respond in more detail, but I'll just say, Laura Ziemer, that sounds like a lot of the projects that we're working on the West. You know, leaky systems and a lot of those Water Smart programs are geared towards that sort of thing. I would say get as many partners as possible and get them together to apply for those dollars.
Thank you. Yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. So I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to start with Dr. Mosley. I really appreciated your testimony about the restoration economy, Doctor, and all the jobs and co-benefits that you get when you invest in these projects. But I want to ask you specifically about one you didn't mention that I think has been a part of the work you've been associated with, and that's at-risk youth and the Youth Conservation Corps. Just tell us briefly a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and a really key component of this sort of the whole ecosystem of training folks from a young age into a variety of career pathways. And certainly in your district, the Kuruk tribe has been focused on this kind of training. The Trinity RC&D has been focused on this kind of training, really thinking about how we help youth transition from high school into career paths in natural resources through on the job training and combined with in-classroom training. And I think that we're seeing more and more that these training programs get people fire qualifications as well as the ability to do forest restoration, in-stream restoration. And so you really start to build a kind of an actual viable multi-season job, which is so critical for rural communities who can really struggle with only having work part of the year.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to Laura Ziemer, and of course, I'm going to give you and Dan Keppen a chance to talk a little more about your partnership. But before I do that, in California, in my state, for about the last decade, we've had an important state public policy of co-equal goals for water management, ecosystem restoration, and water supply reliability. And of course, for the prior 100 years or so, the environment was nowhere near co-equal. It was often an afterthought, often just a casualty of the way we developed water supplies. But we're getting better at finding ways to do it that don't require trade-offs. You mentioned some supply strategies like reuse and desalination that actually can take pressure off those difficult choices where sometimes we're asked to pick winners and losers in water conflicts. But why is it so important that we think of the environment and ecosystems as a co-equal priority as we go forward?
Representative Huffman, as usual, you pose very insightful questions. And the reason why that is so important to have those co-equal priorities is that water security and water resilience are part of the same thing. And water security for communities and people, whether it's irrigation or whether it's municipalities, requires investment in our infrastructure. But water resilient or climate resiliency and water supply security requires a healthy watershed and healthy forest from which that water comes. So it's water security for fish and people to invest in the health of our watersheds simultaneously. And I think those modern solutions where Dan and I find that common ground that we've helped facilitate are those solutions that do try to solve those multiple problems at the same time.
Well, let's get to that fish farm partnership that the two of you have worked on. And Dan, we'll give you the first shot at this. My guess is that you had to do a lot more work than you would on a typical project to try to solve the other party's ecosystem challenge and your water supply challenge, but you got there. How did you do it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think what Laura brought us together was looking at Farm Bill 10 or 12 years ago when it was being created, and we were trying to find ways to encourage more conservation work and also maybe provide extra cash flow for ranchers to do things to help the environment. And what we agreed on was basically we'd rather have ranchers out there working with conservation groups than ranchers going out of business and have a bunch of condos out there. And so we agreed on that narrow focus, and what it's done is it's built trust with time. And now, believe it or not, Laura Ziemer and EDF and California Farm Bureau, we talk about ESA, Chairman Huffman. We don't always reach agreement, but we can talk about it because we got that trust that's been built up by starting out with low-hanging fruit.
Appreciate it, Laura. Anything to add to that?
I would just add to second, of course, everything that Dan Keppen says, but also the kind of dialogue that we now have as a result of that trust means that the most important conversations we have are around things we don't actually see eye to eye on. And that's where we can, I think, make the most progress on having these modern solutions. Because I find when I ask Dan the question, what do you need to make this idea or to make watershed restoration work for your districts? That's when I really learn a lot. And so I really value the insights that our candid conversations bring. And that's a result of the high regard in which I hold Dan.
Well, that's a pretty great place to leave it. I want to thank you and all of our excellent panelists. Thanks to the members who stuck with us for the past 2 hours. I want to remind everyone that members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask them to submit those in writing and ask the witnesses to respond in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee should submit those witness questions within 3 business days following this hearing, and then we'll keep the record open for 10 business days to allow the witnesses to provide their answers. If there is no further business, and I see none, this subcommittee, without objection, stands adjourned. Thanks, everyone.